Hey gang, welcome back to Joe Daddy's Garage. Today's video is part 7 in the 56 Chevy gasser build. In the previous video I left off with me fitting the cross member for the engine and the cross member for the transmission, getting them located, and also setting the engine in place. Very happy with how that turned out, and I've gotten some great comments on ideas that I'll probably incorporate moving forward. One of those ideas was to add some gussets to the front cross member. So I talked to the owner and we found some gussets available at Summit, and these are just triangular gussets, kind of cool with little holes, punched into them. But I'm going to add these to the cross member later. But that's one idea. Another idea was that I should probably add some fillet welds to the transmission cross member. So likely that I will be doing that as well. I still need to fully weld around the cross member to make sure it's all solid, and I don't want to do that until I have the engine back out of the car. Now, where I'm at today, I want to test fit the headers, make sure they're going to fit and clear, which I'm sure they will. But along with that, I need to test fit and try to locate the steering box. Now for this kit, we have a Vega style steering box. These are nice and compact, little steering box. It has 3 holes that already have threads in them. Make note of that. And the kit also came with this bracket. Now, the bracket is intended to be bolted to the steering box and then the bracket welded to the frame. The only problem I have with this, maybe I have more than one problem, but one of the primary problems I have with this is this bracket has 3 holes in it. These upper 2 holes, they're smooth bore. There's no threads or anything in them. The bottom one has threads in it, which correspond to the threads in this steering box. So the debate is, what do you do? Because you can add 2 bolts through these openings, no problem. But this bottom one, you really don't want to turn a bolt into 2 sets of threads. Just put it that way. The likelihood of them lining up and matching whenever you're turning the bolt is not very good. So I may have to consider boring out this hole, but that's a future thing. For now, I just need to figure out how I'm going to mount all this. Now, along with this steering box, I also received this swivel joint, or U-joint, however you want to call it. It has a splined end which will fit onto the shaft of the steering box, and it has what they call a DD shaft, so it's kind of a flat oval, let's say. Now, there's no shaft included with this kit. What the intent is that you attach this, obviously, to the steering box, and then you have to create the second part. Now, the steering column we're going to use in this car is an I Did It steering column, and the owner has it. I've already looked at it. It has that same DD shape, but you can't go directly from the steering box from the steering column to the steering box. It's going to have to be offset. So what we've also bought is a Borgeson double DD, I guess you would call it that. It has the same shape on both ends, and so you can put the shaft into that as well. So what's going to have to happen is you come out of the steering column, angle inboard with the swivel, come forward, and then angle however you need to interact with the steering box. One more thing. We may have to add a center support link, basically like a carrier for the shaft so that it can't move around. Those are on back order, so we're kind of dead in the water on that right now. The shaft was also on back order. It might be here soon. Along with the other pieces, I also have a pitment arm. And this is pretty basic. I mean, it's got just a bolt going through it that's going to attach to what I would call the drag link on the steering. So the challenge is, how do you mount this? So we're going to try to figure that out with this video, but I'm going to show you. But at this point, I want to answer at least one question about the distributor and the clearance between the engine and the firewall. Let's take a look at that. Before I get too far along, I want to show you, these are the headers that I'll be using. These are Patriot brand headers. So They will probably get paint on them in the future, but for right now they're just kind of raw steel. Up front here we have covers over all of the exhaust ports that I'll have to remove, but I want to show you that the concern about the distributor. Now there was obviously a clamp up here with some washers holding this cover down, and if I take this distributor, which is one that I used to use for racing when I built my own engines, that this was a primer kind of distributor. It wasn't meant to be used for anything other than priming the engine. So let me get that lined up. There it is. So now I have a full hands clearance behind that. So that won't be a problem. And the way I did this on top here, I cut a groove in that so I could put a bladed tip in a screw gun and turn this, and it would allow me to prime the oil. So just an observation there. That's other than that, that's really all I need to be concerned with at this point. So I'm going to remove these covers, and another thing that I'm going to do, and this is something I learned again building engines in the past and working with old timers. It was always suggested that you take a tap and run it into any one of those holes just in case there's a burr or if you have some sort of bind. So just keep that in mind if you're ever doing something like this and you haven't done it already. Run a tap into the holes and you'll appreciate that later whenever you go to put bolts back in. So it doesn't appear that there's any real issue with the headers clearing the body or the tire or anything like that, but I want to show you that the steering column will be coming through right here, angled below these last 2 or 3 header pipes. So the steering box, and I know it's difficult to see this with the headers in the way, but the steering box cannot, if I were to try to line this up there, it cannot go here. And the reason for that is the pitman arm. When it's down here, this actually would interact with the frame. So I'm going to have to locate the steering box lower and inboard. So let me pull this header back off, give you an idea what I'm talking about. So with the header out of the way, this is what I was talking about here. This is the shaft where the pitman arm would be. And there's just no way that's ever going to work. This will have to be down low inside the frame and angled kind of parallel with the frame. Reason for that is when you have your pitman arm installed, and you want to make sure you have it on the right way. I mean, obviously it's angled down, right? But you could put it on facing this direction or facing this direction. So the reason I want to identify that is if I take like a pair of vice grips and I turn this shaft, I want to make sure by turning the column one direction that the wheels are going to do the same thing, that they're going to interact the right way. So for now I'm just going to put this on facing with the shaft. I think it actually goes the other way, but we'll figure that out later. But here's where I was talking about with this. You know, if you had it on the upper side, no good. So it may work to have it down here, but I have to make sure I clear the leaf spring and everything else. So I'll have to experiment with that and see what may or may not work. Let me give you a real world example here. Say I have this on the steering shaft attached to the steering column here. If I turn this to the right, it pushes the shaft or the pitman arm to the right, but unfortunately, because the steering arms are on the back side of the axle, that means it's going to push the back of the wheel to the right, which means the front of the wheel will go left. So that's the opposite of what I need. If I turn this around, and I know I don't have it centered, and because the steering arms again are in the back of the car. If I turn this right, now this is pulling left, which makes the wheels turn right. So you can see what I'm saying here. I think when I turn this to the left, it pushes the steering arms, which is on the back of the wheel, that direction, which makes the front turn left. Hope that makes sense. Anyway, there you go. Okay, so I want to show you a couple scenarios here. With this steering box mounted behind the cross member and the pitman arm going forward, as it would need to be to make this work, the angle is too extreme for this U-joint down here and where the steering column comes out. Let me show you from the side. So basically I have a steering column where I think it needs to be. I have it, let's say, at the shallowest point I can come up with through the firewall. The reason for that is if I make it longer, if I bring it down and I start making the shaft for this purpose, I'm going to end up with a shorter piece of metal. But if I make it long and I decide later I want to bring the steering column forward, I can trim down that piece of metal. Keep that in mind when you're doing something like this. Okay, so down here you can see the U-joint. The problem with these U-joints is they have a limit. You can only go so many degrees. I don't know what that number is, but then it binds. It's going to end up getting caught on itself and not be able to move. So currently with the steering box low and low enough that I can make the pitman arm move in where I need it to, if I use this extension as an example, I would have to be way back here for the steering column to work, for that U-joint to work. I cannot compensate enough with either one of these. If this was on here, I'd almost be straight up at 90, straight up and down to make that kind of work. So that's not going to work. There's no way that I can see the steering box is going to work in the back half or behind the cross member. So what does that mean? Change of plans. Another concern was the pitman arm itself is in line with the leaf spring. Basically, it's going to hit. I could get a little bit of clearance underneath, but when it's bolted together, it'll be a conflict. The advantage here is these mount plates that are on the axle. They don't care which side they're on. So they can be on the back side of the axle, or they can be on the front side of the axle. So what that really comes down to is where do you want your tie rod, let's say tie rod, drag link, whatever. Where do you want that? You want it behind the axle, then you have to figure out something else. Put it up here in front, now you get the same action, or the same purpose. You just turn these things around and mount it. This one goes on the driver's side and the other one comes to the passenger side, and now you have your controls ahead of the axle. So I'm going to rearrange everything and hopefully that works. So now I have the steering box in front of the cross member for the engine. You can just maybe see there's the U-joint. What that does is it gives me this much length to compensate for those angles. So once I get a short shaft out of the steering column, connect this U-joint, let's just say it puts it about there. Now this shaft will line up and I think we'll be in business. Now I still have to reconfigure the steering arms, but I'll show you how that looks afterwards. I think the good part here is, of course, that decreased angle. The pitman arm is now out in the open more, so it's between or slightly above the leaf spring. It does carry over the top of the axle. I can't go any further forward because of this other cross member, and then once you do that, you're running into the core support and radiator and all that things, so you have to stay behind that. So that, I think, has to be my answer. Okay, here's where we're at. With the steering box, again, all the way in the front, pitman arm to the rear. Basically I have it at 0 right now, which means if I turn this full 2.5 right or 2.5 left, it ends up centered. and that can be adjusted later if need be. I moved the steering arms. This one was on the passenger side, it's now on the driver's side. So now they're swapped around, and over here, the only problem I have, I say problem, is the fitment arm is right above the axle. Now there's still a good bit of clearance, and the axle isn't going to, move back and forth or anything like that. I have cycled this all the way left and right, and it doesn't hit. The fitment arm doesn't hit anything, and also the axle it clears everything. It doesn't hit the spring. I don't know what else I can do, honestly, because if I put everything, I can't put it in the back. I've already proven that, and I don't know what else I could even do. The only other option would be to move this thing all the way up here, and that is not even an option, because you can't put the steering shaft would have to come through the core support and the radiator, so that it all has to go behind this cross member. So at this point, I have good clearance. If you look up towards the steering column, everything clears nicely. If I give you an example here, and I take this U-joint, I put it in line, there's real good clearance all around. Along with that, another thing to consider in this process is if the steering box had been back here, I would have had trouble with the clutch ball, because I've got this clutch ball here, so I need to have a secondary one on the other side over here for the clutch to actuate. So it wouldn't work anyway. And I really don't have any other options. I know they make different boxes for these, and and they also make rack and pinion, but this is what we're going with. This is kind of more authentic in my opinion, although it would be nice to have the rack and pinion. This is more authentic to the time period and what we're going for. So I think I'm going to weld it. That's where it's going to go, and if we have to change it, we'll do something later, but that's where it is. So here's where we're at now. I welded this plate on, got some welds underneath here, and I have a very long heavy weld on this top edge. I don't think it's going to go anywhere. I took this bolt hole in the steering box and I reamed it to get rid of the threads, because there's threads in this bracket. So in order for those to work, either the threads would have to line up perfectly as they tighten, and they wouldn't do that. When I started putting the bolt in, it pushed the block away, to push the steering box away from the plate to make these threads work. So what I did, again, reamed out this hole, and I shortened the bolt so that it would not hit the inside here. The alternative would have been to drill a hole inside of this boss through the frame. But it's good now. I've got my gap that I wanted down here, and I fitted on the primary U-joint. I took a measurement from, basically it's about 1 inch from this face to the inside here. So I took a measurement, and then, I don't know if you can see it very well, there's the shaft. I brought it up and lined it up with the steering column. Now in this instance, I don't know exactly where the steering column is going to sit, so I left it, this lower shaft is long, and then the upper shaft, what I will do, I checked inside of this. You can go pretty deep up inside of the steering column. There's nothing up there. So I'm going to make this shaft about 4 inches long and put most of it up inside the steering column, and then I will drill a hole through to put a bolt. I had thought about welding this, but if I weld that and I need to change something, that's not good. So I'll put a bolt in there instead, and once I get these lined up even with each other, it'll be set, and it'll take care of the steering. So to demonstrate how this will work, I can slide this right up inside of a steering column. Now this is just, I'm just doing this mainly for demonstration purposes, because when it comes time to put all this together, I will actually have this protruding, and I'm going to avoid drilling the bolt right now, just in case we need to make some adjustments later. So I can slide this in, get it where I need it. Make sure I'm not too deep inside the U-joint, because you don't want it to make contact with anything. And that will probably be good right there. Now I can just take, at least short term, Allen wrench, tighten these up, and I have steering. So once I drill a hole through that, when I'm happy with the final location, run a bolt through it, and it's good to go. Alright, now that I have the steering figured out, there's some other things that need to happen for all this to be finished. One of those things is the brake lines. Now this kit comes with braided brake hoses, and I basically attached it to the caliper, and I was looking at how this is going to work, because normally you have, well, we bought some of these little all-star tabs. Specifically, it says mounting tab, brake line adapter. So, the thought was, initially, to run the brake line behind the shock absorber and have it exposed right there. And after thinking about it a little more, I like it down here, because it hides it a little more. You know, whenever you're doing these cars, the less you can see, probably the better. So, although this would work, I think I'm going to put it underneath the frame. The only problem I've run into at this point is this little tab. They punch a circle, and the brake hose, I don't know if you can see it or not, it actually has corners on it like a bolt or a nut would have. So it's not going to sit over top of that. I did try to put the clip on, and I don't know that it's going to work. It looks like if I try to push this clip in place, no, it'll never do it. It'll crush the clip and never get on there. So I think what I'm going to have to do is kind of replicate that shape a little bit. Break these, or make some corners inside of the circle so that this will sit. It'll also help keep this from turning. So I'll have to be a little proactive in how I want to lay that out and look at where the corners are underneath here. So that's one thing that needs to happen. And then the next thing I want to do is, we bought some of these, again, All-Star Performance. Whoops. These are 1/8 inch gussets, 3-hole 10-pack. And what we're going to do, and it probably isn't going to make much of a difference. Cosmetically it will. I'm going to add this to the top of the cross member for the engine when I weld everything in, and I'm even considering, I'll come to this side since there's no header over here. I'm even considering putting them right here on the inside, front and rear. Now whether it adds a lot of strength or not, I don't know, but it kind of looks cool. You know, these cars are known for having little brackets and stuff like that, so I think I'll be putting these on as well. And then some of the other detail stuff, I want to finish welding the cross member into the frame for the transmission. I still need to cut off these ears that are behind the engine. That's where the old transmission would have mounted, so I need to cut those off. Weld the cross member, and I'm sure there's something else I need to do, but for the bulk of it, that's what needs to happen at this point. So I'm going to try to get brake lines and stuff like this in place. These might go in after I pull the engine back out, because it'll be easier to weld everything. So just so you know, that'll come likely later. As it is, I'm pretty happy with all this right now. So, little detail stuff, that's what I got to do next. Alright, so there's still a bunch of things that need to happen, as I said. I've got to get the brake hoses mounted, I want to get those gussets put on the cross member, and I want to make sure that the steering column is in the right location. Along with that, I need to address the Z-bar. The Z-bar is the actuator for the clutch. Now, because we're using a big block engine and it's slightly offset from where maybe the small block would have sat, that moves the ball where it pivots. It also means I relocate the ball on the frame for the opposite pivot point. I've already mocked that up briefly, and I'll cover more of this in the next video, but at this point I'm going to have to maybe do some customizing to the Z-bar so that the movement is correct. Because when you start getting things out of alignment, it binds up and causes problems. Now, this steering setup, there are variations out there. There's all kinds of things that people have done over the years. This may not be the ideal situation, but remember, this car is not meant to be drag raced. It is more of a show car. It is something that's going to be casually driven. It's never going to go down a racetrack. And if we have problems with bump steer or anything like that in the process of figuring all this out, maybe we'll come back and address it then. So I know there's been some concern about that, but at this point we want to make it drivable. That's the goal. That's the goal. So we are moving forward. The owner has ordered the steering column mount and also the ball for the Z-bar, and if we need anything else, we'll just have to get it. But that'll be it for this video. I want to thank you for continuing to support me, especially my patrons. And if you would, leave a comment on this video. Leave a thumbs up. As with all my videos, that is a great encouragement for me personally, and it also lets YouTube know that people are interested in the content that I'm putting out. So I can't do it without you. So help me out if you can. But that'll be it. And until next time, take care of yourselves. See ya.